Welcome to the Fully Mindful podcast. I'm your host, Melissa. I designed this podcast for you. I'm so happy you're here. We are talking about what it means to live with more intention, creativity, and authenticity so we can make aligned connections. I'm a neurodivergent lawyer turned coach who found the healing power of breathwork and the powerful impact of mindfulness as we navigate this wild and beautiful ride of life. Here at the Fully Mindful, we dive deep with inspiring guests, share solo mini-sodes that are packed with tools you can apply immediately, and I mix it up a bit with tangents and sidebars, where my friend and host of the New World Normal podcast, Debbie Harrell, joins us for some down-to-earth, sometimes random, but always meaningful conversations. If you're ready to breathe, reflect, and grow, you're in the right place. Let's get fully mindful. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Melissa, your host of the Fully Mindful. Today, I'm talking with Jules Kuroda. She's an executive coach, author, and creator of the book, The Innate Self, You Are More Than Your Mind, Body, and Emotions, which provides a framework that invites us to move beyond the familiar terrain of mind, body, and heart into a deeper, often overlooked part of our human experience, the spirit. Drawing on her work with leaders and seekers alike, Jules helps people reconnect with meaning, presence, and what she calls our innate being. Her book explores 8 characteristics that shape how we experience connection, purpose, and joy, and offers a path forward for anyone feeling stuck, restless, or curious about what lies beneath the surface of our busy lives. So glad to have you here today, Jules. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Melissa. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
I guess I want to start kind of at the beginning, which makes the most sense. If you can tell us about how you got where you are today and what motivated you to write The Innate Self.
Absolutely. In my work, you mentioned that I am an executive coach, and I've been doing that work for about 10 years. But before I did that work, I've had I think about my career in chapters. I've had work in academia, I've had work in nonprofits, I've done startups, I've done corporate. One of the things that's been so interesting to me across my career is I've had the opportunity of working with people from over 50 different countries. And there is something that has always been present, no matter who I'm talking to, no matter who I'm dealing with. What is the quality? What is the essence of the humanity that we share? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in some anecdotes. But as I was having all of these conversations with executives, we would be talking about how to be more productive in our workplace and how to unlock the team and all these things. At the end of a lot of these coaching conversations, they would kind of have this exhale moment where they would be like, yeah, but what's it all for? Or, but what is the meaning? Or am I really contributing? Or where's the joy in the work? And it was really remarkable to me, honestly, because you kind of slowly see this facade melt away as you work with people who are in these high power kind of stressful positions that come back down to these fundamental human questions. Mm-hmm. And what I really realized from a coaching perspective, we have all these frameworks to help us understand our mental space, right? Limiting beliefs and the power of the mind. The mind is amazing. It can really unlock so many things, but it also has its limitations, and it's also wired to do some very specific things. We have frameworks to help us kind of understand that. And then we also have frameworks to help us understand emotional intelligence and how we think about kind of EQ. We train on that in organizations. And then more recently, we've been talking about kind of somatic work, like where you hold stress in your body. That's been a big movement throughout the wellness space. But what we haven't had is a framework to talk about this more vulnerable, sensitive, deeply human part of ourselves that we all experience, which is our need for connection and joy and contribution and meaning and creativity and all those things. So that is how I got to the innate self. And really, I'm trying to introduce a framework to help us in the personal development and coaching space digest and understand this kind of esoteric thing that we don't often know how to engage with outside of kind of religious moments. But it's something that we all have and it's innate in us. And so it's important, I think, to have a way to unpack that.
Yeah, I mean, in some of the spheres that I'm in, we call it having contact with sort of that more intelligent internal self,
Yeah,
right? Having some sort of conscious contact with that self. And I suspect and know, having worked with some corporate and lawyer folk, that that language is not really, it's not used well, it's not understood well. And so providing some sort of understanding or framework so that they can still benefit from connecting with that inner, more wise, sage self is really important and really provides this next step. And I guess I'm encouraged that when you've worked with people in these areas, that they are actually willing to go there.
absolutely. And I think, it's been really interesting to see the post-COVID movement, like what's happening with all of these articles coming out around Gen Z and what Gen Z wants in the workplace. I think there is something that culturally we're missing in terms of conversations about purpose and meaning, but we long for it. And I think that as new generations enter the workplace, they want their work to be filled with meaning and purpose. And they're going to ask for that. They're going to ask for that. They're going to ask for wellness. And so we have to have a different way of talking about this. We have to have a way of talking about it to begin with, I think. And to start to think about what are these characteristics that we all have and look for, and how do we feed this part of ourselves and understand it? So yeah, and you mentioned something that I think is important just around like the conscious piece, which the innate stands for kind of our higher nature. That's the capital N in nature with the 8 characteristics. So that's a bit of how that came to be in terms of the framing. I love a good double entendre, so it's also innate in us. It works on both levels, I hope.
Yeah, and I think when you're talking about purpose and meaning for people wanting and longing for more of that in their work or just in their lives in general, you're not talking about, I guess, what more traditionally, at least in the corporate world, high achieving worlds would be like, oh, well, my purpose is to serve this corporation and to, somehow produce whatever it is that we're supposed to be producing. It's really about a greater sense of purpose, something that maybe serves the greater good or humanity or something of that nature.
Yeah, and there's lots of research out there. Just after you hit a certain level of success, a lot of times there is this moment of pause that will happen for people just around, okay, I've done all these things, I've been so productive, and I've created all this value, quote unquote, in the economic space. But what is the meaning of the value I've created? Because when we talk about value at that level, we're talking monetary. And I think we all long to know that what we're doing is longer lasting or it has a different impact. Like we really want to connect with people. We're wired for that. And so if I'm not contributing something meaningful, it's kind of like eating junk food all the time. Like you fill up but never feel full. And
Mhm.
so I think it's that piece, right? And like meaning can be big and meaning can be small. Like I talk in the book about micro versus macro meaning. I think it's important that we just recognize we're meaning makers. We look for meaning and like, oh, she just looked at me with a funny look. I don't know what that means. We tell ourselves stories about that stuff all the time. And so it's just a part of how we think and process. And it also is a part of what we look for when we have those reflective moments in our life.
Mhm.
Um.
And are you finding, whether through your work with this book or when you're working with executives or other people, that people are struggling with this in the sense that they have no idea how to find the meaning that they're looking for?
I think that it's a really good question. I think what I see is that people might be avoiding the question. Like
Mm,
they have this nagging feeling of what's the purpose, what's the meaning, but if we don't talk about it, if we don't create shared language for it, we have a tendency to kind of numb our way through it, whether that be just like doom scrolling, getting sucked into the world of whatever. There's all kinds of bad habits that we have to kind of stuff that down. But I think that part of it is we don't know how to have the context or create the space to have the conversation. And if I don't get to talk about the meaning I want in my life with anyone, if I never connect on that level, then meaning doesn't happen individualistically. It happens in connection.
mhm.
And that's not to say our lives aren't meaningful individually. It's to say that we find meaning in the connection, in the interaction between us. Those are the most meaningful moments often for us. And so without being able to have that open conversation to talk about these things, I think we kind of close it down, or we don't know what to do with it. And then that causes us to go into other negative patterns.
Yeah, it's kind of a positive feedback loop, right? And the irony really is we do these things, whether it's doom scrolling or for many people, being myself included, being too busy, always doing,
Absolutely.
and not being enough. Then we avoid the very thing that we are actually looking for, right? We're
Yeah.
looking for the connection, we're looking for the greater meaning, and yet we are doom scrolling or keeping ourselves too busy or watching Netflix until midnight or whatever we might be doing. Or in some
Yeah.
people's cases, they might be drinking too much or
Yeah.
stuffing themselves full with junk food, to use your
Analogy,
analogy.
right?
And so, yeah, so the idea here is that you're creating the space and the language for this to even come to consciousness, right? So people don't even know that they were necessarily looking for, they had like an inkling that something's missing. There's some hole inside their soul. There's something missing, but they didn't even know how to language it, right? And so
Absolutely.
you're helping us with innate self to be able to language what it is that we're even looking for. Is that right?
That's my hope. Yeah, absolutely. And, Melissa, I think there's something really important kind of culturally happening for us right now around the anxiety space. Like we talk a lot about anxiety, or we have been talking a lot about that. And I think it's become sort of a catch-all space for anything we don't know how to deal with, that
Mhm.
we feel that feeling. And I do talk about this in the book, that I think we've started to conflate like mental anxiety, which is a very real thing, with like the spiritual crisis that I think a lot of people are going through, because they either don't know how to connect with something greater than themselves, they don't know how to think about purpose or meaning, or don't feel space to have those conversations to build that connection with one another. We are meant to, like, it is how we are built. We are meant to connect with one another. We're meant to have deep conversations, and we're not facilitating our lives around that. We facilitate our lives so much more around productivity, busyness. And I think this is the slippery slope of social media, which is that sort of dopamine transactional nature,
Mhm.
where if I just see and I feel like I'm connecting with you online, it's not the same as genuine, like belly laughs over dinner. It's a different type of connection and much more transactional. And so it's leaving us feeling hungry, but we don't know how to quite pinpoint that. And so we feel anxious, or we feel lonely, or we feel depressed. And that's all getting bucketed up under that kind of mental wellness bucket. And some of it truly is, and some of it, I think, is we've misdiagnosed the problem.
Right. It might be more of a spiritual anxiety rather than a
Exactly.
mental anxiety, but
Exactly.
we either lack the language around it or maybe are unwilling to look at that because we think it means we have to be religious or, have some sort of spiritual in a more dogmatic sense
Yeah.
approach, right? And what you're saying is no, we don't have to have that, right? It can be, you can have spiritual consciousness without having religion or dogma. In fact, I think you are very adamant that we release any ideology, right, in order to connect more authentically with one another.
Yeah, the way I would say it is, I think that people think about engaging with this part of themselves, like the doorway into thinking about your spiritual self is through beliefs. And I think about beliefs as the outflow of having engaged with this part of yourself. So whatever comes, that's not the door in, it's maybe the door out. But just like we recognize we have an emotional heart, we have a physical heart, we have an emotional heart. It's dualistic in nature. We have this part of ourselves. We have this part of us that is energetic, that brings us joy, that wants to create, that seeks purpose and meaning. And we have to give oxygen to that space without all the pressure of ideology. And so I think that's the thing. I want us to be able to talk about it like a known thing. Like I have this aspect of self and I want to understand it and I want to engage with it. And then whatever my belief structure is flows out from that, but not let it be a barrier of entry to it.
Right. And I know you have this beautiful example that you've described about connecting without ideology, even without language, right? Where you've connected with people in the various times in your life when you've had different jobs, when you've traveled, when you're communicating with people who don't even share the same language with you, and yet you've been able to connect with them deeply. And that in itself has been a bit of a spiritual experience, it sounds like. Is that right?
100%. And like one of the stories I think you're referring to, when I was doing refugee resettlement in Chicago, I was working with the pre-literate, meaning they'd never even learned how to read or write in their own language. So everything was verbal. And so if they couldn't communicate in English, they came from all over the world. But some of my nearest and dearest came from Bhutan and had lived in Nepal for like 40 years. And I had this family that showed up at my doorstep in like full Bhutanese garb. I mean, they were just like bright yellow and orange and beautiful, beautiful people, just smiling, couldn't say a word of English. Maybe hi was it. And as I got closer to their family through the daily interaction of the classroom, language was never the thing that united us. And they did invite me to their home. And there was this kind of beautiful ceremony that they performed over me where they invited me to come and sit before them and put the tika, which is like red dye on your forehead during the Diwali festival. And it was wordless and so meaningful. Like there was no way I didn't understand the power and implication of the kind of connection and feeling that they were extending to me. They were inviting me into their family, and it all happened without language. So that's like we touch these moments of human connection, we touch these moments of human experience, but they require something. We have to drop something. We have to drop a layer of protection. Like, I talk about in the book how I almost didn't go to their house because I was too intimidated. I was like, what are we going to do? This is going to be so intimate and we can't talk our way through it. So I think that's something to notice what we try to fill the space with, because we feel vulnerable and we really don't like to feel vulnerable. And so, that's one of the ways, like I talk about the mind being a frenemy. It's wonderful and it's powerful and it does so many wonderful things for us, but it also really can protect us from joy and connection and make us very afraid if we don't pay attention to it.
Let's take a quick break.
Hey everybody, this is Melissa with The Fully Mindful. Have you been curious about the power of the breath? Join me for in-person or online breathwork sessions in the new year. We have themes such as awaken, reset and manifest, love and kindness, empower and energize, and more. We'll use conscious connected breathwork for truly transformational sessions with curated music and somatic coaching. Visit the website at thefullymindful.com for detailed information on upcoming sessions. Fulfill your need for personal development and breathe into the new year with purpose and intention. See you there. Yeah, and I love that story about the connection without really any language at all. And I've certainly experienced similar moments in my travels where there really isn't a way to communicate except maybe through hand gestures, right? But feeling very connected through body language, just through being with one another and being vulnerable, right? It is very vulnerable not to share a language and feel like you don't know how to communicate in that way. But we have so many other ways of communicating. And I was thinking about, I don't know if you've been following the telepathy tapes at all or
No.
Oh my gosh. Okay. This is just, you gotta get there. So the telepathy tapes are, you'll be fascinated. It's basically a journalist, a woman who is interested in studying this, but there are autistic, totally nonverbal people who are apparently, it appears from people who are studying them, that they are able to read minds. And basically the idea is, and they've kind of proven this, and it's all sorts of people without agendas, et cetera. I'll let people check that out on their own. But this idea that there is one consciousness, right, that we share is, I think, what they're getting at. And certainly, from my background, limited as it may be in Buddhism, is also one consciousness, right? And this idea that we're all on this same plane together. And I think that's what that example that you talk about in the book with the Bhutanese family and what you've just shared here, that's what it reminds me of, is like we connect on this kind of more spiritual plane. We don't need the language in order to connect because we're already there.
Mm-hmm. But what you're talking about, I think it takes, there's something we have to drop in order to kind of sit in that space and to expose ourselves to that kind of connection. You know, when I was going through my coaching program, one of the exercises they had us do was practice intuition. And it was so uncomfortable. I mean, it was so uncomfortable. Like sit, stare at the other person for 2 minutes, no talking. And you just felt all these emotions rise up as you were like, oh my gosh, this feels so intense to just sit and stare at this person. Some people would start laughing. Some people would start kind of wanting to hide. So it's just a really interesting thing to be that witnessed. At the end of this exercise, they would essentially say, close your eyes. And now think about what this person is in terms of a color. And what would happen is it would create some space for your intuition to bubble up. It was actually incredibly profound as an experience because the person who was my partner, what she reflected back to me was like, things I would wish that people would say about me that, you know, I would never say out loud, but she was like, your color is like the color of sunrise, you know, you represent light and beauty. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so touched. And to know someone without knowing them, you know, that is like stepping into that thread of connection, as I talk about it in the book, I think is so powerful. And I feel like we can access it too. We start to feel it when we step into nature. Like nature is so interconnected. And that had a profound impact on me. It had a profound impact on the book. I got to spend a lot of time in nature during the pandemic. And when you just sit and kind of reflect and watch and observe, you see how interwoven it all is and how dependent on each other it all is. And it feels very symbolic to me of how we are with each other. We just kind of forget that.
Yeah. And I mean, nature is incredible. And another author who has been on this podcast before, Michael Amster, who co-wrote a book called The Power of Awe with Jake Eagle. And they talk about this emotion of awe that has also been studied by others and how we can find it anywhere. You can find it in the computer screen if you really look. But really, it's so much easier to find that in nature, even if you don't have access to big nature, like the Grand Canyon or something like that, the trees and the flowers outside, or I'm lucky enough to live near a nature park, so I have full access. But just being able to experience that connection with nature does, I think, expand that sense of connection with awe. And you know, you can find awe if you just look at a beautiful flower for 30 seconds, right? And really contemplate the flower and what it means and how it looks and how it makes you feel.
And children are like excellent at this. And this is one of the things, you know, I have a small child and he is a constant reminder of, I think, what just like the bud of a human being does. Like we went out the other day and he saw a patch of clover and he just starts picking up the clover and dancing. And he's like, look how beautiful it is. And it was just so like, that's how we could be if we would allow ourselves, but we kind of grow out of it as we grow up. We tell ourselves to, right? And that diminishes joy somehow, I think, but it's kind of closing off that connection in part because we have to be more productive than that. And you got to grow up and the things we tell ourselves, be serious. And we don't even recognize that we're slowly kind of closing off those portals of connection and joy.
Yeah. And I love that story about your kiddo with the clover. And, you know, I remember when I was going through a coaching certification training and and it was somatic coaching, and they kept talking about finding your playful part, finding play. And I remember it was so fascinating to me to notice what came up for me when someone even said the word play or playful. I just was like, no, big, hard, no, not doing that at all. And it was fascinating to look at that and see how it was that I had come to having such aversion to playful joy, right? And I've worked through it through systematic coaching, but and I suspect I was not alone, that especially with a lot of the corporate people that you've worked with in your work, people who might be reading the Innate Self might have that initial aversion to play. Like, okay, joy is even hard to wrap one's mind around, but play?
Yeah.
Any suggestions for people who might have
Yes.
kind of discovered that aversion or that anxiety?
Absolutely. But before I get into that, the first thing we want to do is to notice the language that pops up for you. So if you're like, I feel silly, I feel uncomfortable, like whatever it is, it helps you understand how your mind has framed the experience. And again, kind of going back to this idea that our mind is our frenemy, it's there, it helps us in so many things. It's a tool, but if we don't use it appropriately, it will invert itself on us. I talk a little bit about the internal roommates that live in our heads. But I feel silly is like, that's our critic. That's our critic coming out and saying, now, don't you do something foolish that looks crazy now? Like, don't you do that? People will judge you, right? So there's that protective layer, I think, that comes in. And in part, what we have to do is to just recognize that, like, okay, this is my mind telling me that this isn't okay because of whatever association I have, whatever I'm trying to protect myself from looking foolish or being embarrassed. If I say, okay, thank you, I recognize that that's here to protect me, but I don't need the protection right now. We can start to get into a little bit of creativity. And I think this is one of the innate characteristics I talk about. I think creativity is such a place for play, such a place for joy. But it's interesting, as you talk about working with executives, I do these different workshops, and a lot of times I'll ask people, what are some of your big dreams, like big dreams, big dreams? Yeah. And I'll get things like, oh, I want to lose 10 pounds, or, I'd like to go back and finish this certification or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, that's a goal. I wouldn't call that a dream. And the reaction that I get when I have those conversations, like I had one guy come up to me and say, like, I loved everything about your workshop, except for the part where you told me that I had to have a dream. That felt silly. That felt childish was the word he used.
Wow. Yeah.
And I'm
I get that, right?
Right.
I understand.
Yeah, it's like we turn off or turn down our ability to feel like we can be creative and not feel foolish in some way. And when we do that, we shut off a valve, I think, to joy, to one of the core aspects of ourself. We all are creative. Whether or not you think about yourself as creative or not is a whole other topic, because we tend to think about creatives as being like artistic people, but that's just one type of creativity. And that's one of the things I do break down in the book, is there are 4 different types of creativity. Engineers are inherently creative, but they're functional creatives. They're not artistic creatives. And so we built these boxes that we try to live by. And if it doesn't fit the box, then, we kind of push it away. And so I think going back to like, how can we practice play a little bit more? I think asking ourselves, where do you allow yourself to be creative? And what do you want to create that you don't allow yourself to create because of something you're telling yourself? And just notice that and explore that, because creativity is a straight way into playfulness, in my opinion.
I love that. And I should have asked this earlier, but we just got into such an interesting conversation. Can you go over what the 8 characteristics are in the innate self, since we've already talked about creativity? Let's dive in.
Yeah. So the first characteristic is character. So I talk a lot about how character is really the place of where our values live. It's where our moral code lies. I think about our moral code as like our personal 10 commandments. It's the things we cannot violate, or we feel just something is horribly wrong. It's also where ethics lives. Ethics is such an interesting place. That could be, there's lots of books on ethics, but I think the thing to ask for yourself as you think about your character is, how do I want to use my values in ethical gray moments? Because that builds sort of the bedrock of who we want to be. And then from there, we go into the next of our 8 characteristics, which is contribution. So we all want to be able to give the things that we're good at, right? If you're good at coaching, you want to be able to do that because it makes something alive in you, and it feels great to contribute the things that you have to offer in your skills, in your talents, in your perspective. Like, we really like to share those pieces. And so that's contribution, and our need for contribution, I think, is directly connected to connection. But it is different from connection in the sense that connection is much broader, but contribution is such a great way into connection. I think connection was my largest section because I think it is so robust I think we are struggling a lot with the definition of it. How do I do it in our current climate? And I wanted to make sure that we're thinking about connection on a multidimensional level of like, how do I connect with myself versus how do I connect with you versus how do I connect with the greater. So that's connection. And then that flows into creativity, which is really like, how do you like to create? We all create. Even the words we're speaking right now is creation, right? So we can't get outside of it. It's just sometimes not our mental image of it. So really unpacking that together. And then from there, it's generosity. So it's interesting because I found that a lot of people think about generosity and contribution as similar things, but I think they're quite different. Like contribution is, these are skills and things I have to give, and it makes me feel good to do it. It's part of how I find purpose in my day. Meaning is how I feel alive. Whereas generosity is a little bit less, it's just a gift. It's just
Expectations and
no expectations. Exactly. But I also have found, Melissa, that a lot of people think about generosity as kind of just financially, but there are multi dimensions of generosity that we can have. We can be generous with our time, with our presence, with our words, with our thoughts. So there's so many different with our actions. And generosity is, it's the like it's more blessed to give than to receive aspect, right? So it really makes us feel good. Then gratitude. Gratitude is a interesting one because I think it's gotten a lot of positive PR in the last decade. I don't think about gratitude just as an attitude, which I think a lot of people might think like, okay, put on your happiness gratitude jacket. I think gratitude is also like sitting in the uncomfortable places. And a lot of people who I have known to be the most grateful people are people who have struggled the most. They've gone through real pain and suffering. And so rising out of that, feeling grateful is really powerful.
Right. Even grateful for the things that have been difficult.
Yes. And what it's done in their perspective, how it's like grown them or stretched them. The seventh characteristic is courage. I talk about the difference between courage and bravery, which I think of as two different muscles related, but not the same. Courage has this element of like for others in it. So brave, to do something brave is to face a fear. I've got a fear of heights and I walk across a really tall bridge or I jump out, bungee jump or something of that nature. Whereas courage is like a willingness to do something that you're scared of for someone else. There's an element of for the sake of something bigger than you. It doesn't always have to be direct to another person, but it's for the sake of something bigger is how I think about courage.
And I love that too, because as you probably know, in French and other Latin languages, cœur, which is the basis of courage, is heart, right? So it's from the heart.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Which automatically means you're doing it not just for yourself, but for others.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that takes us to the eighth one, which is about meaning. And I talk about big meaning and little meaning, micro and macro, and meaning and how it relates to purpose. But we all seek meaning, even in little tiny things. So just really helping unpack kind of that human nature element. And all of these characteristics are inherently connected. They're not totally separated. And they build on one another.
Right. And so by tapping into these more, so through some of the guidance that you've given in your book, we can become less stuck, less alone, more connected with others. We can tap into our innate self just by kind of getting in there and working on each of these 8 characteristics that we all automatically have. It's just maybe we've let 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or more kind of not get as much attention as some of the others. So when we can work toward igniting those more, we have a better shot of getting more meaning, more connection, more joy in our lives.
Absolutely. And, I think at some level, I mean, I've never met a person yet who's like, I don't want a fulfilling life. We all want to feel fulfilled, and fulfillment can come through multiple different ways. But if we can understand these 8 characteristics and that these are like areas of our life, they're like muscles you can build, and we work on each one of them, like, you're going to feel that fulfillment. And so I think as we talk about going kind of to this where we started just around anxiety and depression and all of that, like if we focus on building these individual muscles, it's a way through kind of that spiritual crisis piece that we talked about.
Yeah. And I guess I want to ask you this. You talk about these as sort of, well, I guess, what do you say? I forget how you said it. You love complexity, but strive for simplicity, I think is how you put it. So within this innate framework, can you talk about that? Like, how are we loving complexity, but actually aiming for simplicity?
Absolutely. So I think when you start with a question like, what is the meaning of life? Which I think a lot of people are like, that's a scary big question and I don't know how to tackle it. That's complex, right? There's lots of different ways to think about that. There's ways to embrace that, but that's a daunting place to start. So if we can break it down into component parts of like, well, let's just look at one aspect of yourself. Let's just spend some time focusing on your character. A lot of what I did throughout the book is really try to employ my coaching skills to help build like a guide through it, to reduce the complexity and to, hey, you could spend your whole life thinking about character. I mean, Benjamin Franklin did. He had a whole ethos around how you build character. Yes, and you don't have to do it like that. What does a bite-sized approach on character look like? Just to start to unpack something really juicy. And then if you're like, wow, this is something I'm super interested in, go do a deep dive study on that and go get into Ben Franklin's virtues and all of that. But you don't have to swallow the whole elephant in order to start to unpack and sort of simply understand these different pieces of us that all want some space. They all want some oxygen and a place to come alive.
Yeah, I love that. You don't have to be a stoic.
No, you don't.
It's wonderful if you want to be, but you don't have to be.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not about perfection. It's just about some sort of progress. I think you talk about kind of finding your way home, really, which I love that as a metaphor. And I guess maybe can you talk a little bit about how the innate self in this framework has helped you find your way home back to you?
Yeah. I wrote this throughout the pandemic, and I think that was such an interesting time because our social constructs were all shutting down. And how that impacted us psychologically and emotionally and culturally for sure. It was a lot of constriction. And spending some time in nature gave me a lot of space. It really brought a different type of abundant mindset to me. I know we talk a lot about what abundance mindset means, but for me, it was really understanding how big the world is and how I am just this piece of it. And how can I think about my problems with some perspective and myself as like a multidimensional being that has all these things I want to do in life. I have all these things, but we get so caught up in our problems and in our mindset. So if we can start to recognize, one of the takeaways I really hope that people have from this is we're living in a moment where we are so obsessed with our minds. Like everything is about how we think. And there's so much power there, but it is not the end all be all to us. There is a whole other piece of us, which is what mindfulness practices are trying to help us uncover. But I think sometimes people just read the word mindful and they just double down back on the mind. Like they don't actually understand what it means to like be in your being, as you talked about. So for me, this offers like a checklist almost of when I feel off balance, what am I off balance in? Am I practicing enough gratitude? Or am I maybe not giving enough? And what I've noticed is when I'm feeling like I'm not getting enough, it's usually when I'm not giving enough. Yeah. So it just helps me invert the problem and do something about it versus getting all stuck up in my head and feeling miserable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find, for instance, you were talking about anxiety. When I'm feeling that sort of angst or anxiety, that fluttering in the chest and the heart and my head is racing, that's when I'm not spending enough time in nature and connecting with that deeper part of myself. Because the second I do, it all calms down. It just calms down.
And
Right.
isn't that a hack? Isn't it such a hack? It's like, and this is what I love the practice of forest bathing, in the Japanese tradition, because it's just like, and all the science is proving it, but it's just like kind of this ancient wisdom
Yeah.
of step outside, take some good fresh breaths of air. Like who doesn't like fresh air? It's just we're designed for it. Partially because back to your oneness, like we're a part of it, and we don't think about ourselves as being a part of it, so therefore we separate ourselves from it. But when we allow ourselves to connect, it's so quick that we start to just like drop some of that
Yeah. And
stress.
it's not just the emotional or mind stress. I remember, I cannot recall her name right now. She's a doctor, and she was talking, she's a gut specialist, and she was talking about, and I mean, she's an MD, I mean, and published studies and all those things. But she said, when you're not feeling well, like when you're physically ill, you have a cold or the flu or something, even just stepping outside will actually produce, it's in favor of the healing bacteria rather than the bad bacteria, which is just amazing. So even on the physical level, just getting outside is going to not only help you downregulate your nervous system if that's what's going on, but if you're ill, it'll actually help you heal faster. And then she said, even if you can't get outside, just even looking out your window and maybe cracking it for just to get the fresh air, as you were saying, the fresh air is helpful. So it's fascinating to me that the power of nature, and we're connected to it, right? We're part of it, we are of it, and how helpful that can be.
I totally agree. And I feel like all this research that's coming out about the microbiome in our gut is just another layer of reinforcing this. It's like, yeah, the more we eat nature, the more of those good things we have in our body, the healthier we are. It's like on the outside and on the inside. We're just so wired for it. And we don't always think like that. I think we often don't think like that. We think about ourselves as separate. So, but nature has a way of pulling perspective out, I think. It's just one of those really cool things about nature. It just helps us to have different perspective. So even little things, just taking a walk outside, I mean, really can work wonders.
Yeah, I've even just stood outside when I'm having a stressful day and just took in a couple of deep breaths, like you were suggesting, and it makes a big difference, more than I would have thought.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, getting back to the Innate Self, your book, how would you say, and I don't know if you, like, I know you address this in your book, but how does the innate self intersect with the collective well-being? So obviously it's good for us on a personal level, but how does it impact us as a collective?
Yeah, I talk about, our characteristics. Before I get into the characteristics, I talk about the qualities that we have. I use the analogy of the heart because I think it's a really good one. We have a metaphorical heart, an emotional heart, and we have a physical heart. We understand that. Nobody debates that we have both of those hearts. I think the same kind of thinking needs to happen for us around we are individual, but we are connected. Because yes, I am an individual, but there is no question when you sit in silence with someone experiencing a moment in life, like a sunrise, a birth of a child, that you don't feel something, you don't feel some layer of connection. And so the more we can start to tap into that, I think the more we understand, the healthier I am individually. It's like a forest, right? The healthier that I am individually, the more I have to share with you, which will help you be healthier, which will help other people be healthier. And so I think a lot about tree networks, the way the root systems work. Janine Benyus is an incredible biomimicry. She does a whole study on the network effect, the network systems that are in nature, and how much we can learn from that. And I think like once you start to understand how the systems work inside of nature, it's so interesting how similar it is for us. The more that we individually are healthy, again, the reverse can also be true. Like healthier cultures can create more individual health. If we can build more consciousness in our community, the more that we'll all benefit from that. And that's something that Dr. Joe Dispenza did a lot of research on in Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. Have you read that book?
Oh, yeah.
It's a good one, right? He talks about he was studying specifically, I think, like the power of prayer and how it affects people's health that are nowhere near. And so you talk about that connected energy. You can prove it out in science. It's throughout our entire human history, in the ethos, the mythology, the stories of spirituality throughout all of history in every country. There is this truth that has survived.
Yeah, and I mean, even if you just look at it on the physical plane, or on the physical plane, like if you think about it, and I can't remember exactly how this goes, but every breath we take in the breath of all who have lived before us, literally, we're taking in their cells. and so it's like, if you weren't if you didn't feel connected, like, remember that, and that when we're gone, when our physical bodies are gone, our cells will be breathed into every future generation there ever is. And so, yes, even on the physical plane, we're super connected. And then, of course, on the emotional and spiritual plane, I wish we could talk about this forever, but since we're coming to a close, I want to make sure that we've talked about everything that you were interested in talking about. Is there anything that I should have asked you that we didn't get to talk about that you were hoping we would?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered a lot. I think the one other thing maybe I would say is, I do unpack a bit more in the book just the constructs of the mind and how we might engage with that. Because there are different tools that I have in the book to just help kind of unpack some of these things in a more tangible way, ideally, so that you walk through and you're like, okay, how do I actually have a little toolkit to do something different or to engage with this? So that would just be the last thing I'd share.
I definitely see it more as a guidebook rather than just some sort of heady, your philosophical look at these characteristics. You're really providing some significant, here's some simple things that you can do to tap into your innate self, which I really appreciate. Yeah. So I guess that's probably, we're just wrapping it up. And so can you tell people how they can find you and where to find your book?
Yes. So you can find me on my website at theinnateself.com, and you can find my book, The Innate Self, on Amazon.
That's awesome. And anything that you're working on now that we can expect somewhere down the road?
Well, I'm thinking deeply about the innate leadership and what that might look like as a framework. I think there's a lot to this that is applicable to leadership. And so really starting to deep dive into that.
Oh, I can't wait. I know that leadership needs to tap into their innate self. So I'm very excited for you to do that deep dive and do that work. And then, of course, have you back on the podcast to talk all about it.
Well, thanks so much, Melissa. I really enjoyed being here. Really appreciate you having me on.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for joining me on the Fully Mindful podcast. If you got value from this episode, I'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, or share this episode with someone who loved this content too. Remember, small moments of mindfulness can lead to big changes in your day-to-day life. Until next time, take a deep breath, stay present, and tap into your own mindfulness. I'll see you next week.